Hello, my name is Konstantin. I'm a sales engineer with env0. And now let's get started with environment output variables and env0 workflows. In this demo, I'm going to deploy a workflow with three environments: an Azure virtual network, an AKS cluster, and a Kubernetes deployment to install Flux on the cluster. In env0, I have a workflow template containing workflow and its configuration files that is added to my organization. It's pointing to the repository where my code lives, and it's my private repository. Speaking of the projects, I made this workflow available for the project where I'm going to run it. And it's important to note that within the settings, under the policies, I need to enable environment outputs checkbox. So make sure you do that as well. Now let's deploy the workflow. From the environments view, I'll create a new environment in a project and I'll select the template from the options. And it's going to show me an option to create it from this workflow. And I'm going to click Run Now. The wizard suggests a unique environment name for this workflow. I'll leave it as is, and this workflow will be tracking the main branch. So I'll leave that default as well. There are three sub-environments defined for the workflow, and we can access individual settings for each one of them by selecting its alias and going into the settings. I'm going to leave this all as is, and I'm going to go ahead and deploy this environment. This will take us to the deployments of the environment, which will be a very neat graph showing the relationship between each sub-environment. The virtual network environment is currently being deployed, and we can track its progress by clicking on it. And while it's running, let's check out the code behind it. This is the repository where my code is configured. And if I open the env0.workflow.yaml file, here I can clearly see how each sub-environment is being defined. I see that the network is being deployed first, and next is the AKS cluster, and it needs the virtual networks connection first. Similar to that, we see the next environment is the Flux one, and it depends on the AKS. So we can use the environment output variables to pass the values from the virtual network into the AKS cluster, and similarly pass the values, the outputs from AKS into the Flux. Back into the env0 UI, our workflow deployment failed because the AKS cluster environment doesn't have the relevant input value. So if I click into it and scroll to the failed error, I will see that it needs this variable as defined in the code. So let's fix that with environment outputs. I'm going to go into the variables. I'm going to add an environment output variable and reference the previous step of the virtual network and the relevant subnet ID. I'm going to click Save and redeploy. Now we see that the virtual network stays active, whereas our AKS cluster is being redeployed. I can see that it worked great. And the AKS cluster is now active. And now it's going to trigger the Flux installation. Now, Flux installation also needs some input variables set. So I'll jump over to that environment and start by adding the relevant values. So if I go back to my code and go to the variables that need to be defined, here I see four variables that I'm going to copy paste into my Terraform variables. And I'm going to reference them from the EKS client certificate, client key, I've added all of them, and I'm going to click run. Now I can see my Flux is being deployed. So after a few minutes, we now have a virtual network, an EKS cluster, and a bootstrapped Flux installation that's ready to start accepting your application configurations. And we did it all with environment output variables rather than trying to pass sensitive information through some other solution.